Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about the 1960s, and a lot happens in America in the 1960s. You have the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the war protests, and the whole idea of a counterculture comes to the forefront. So those are the things that we will be discussing this week. All right, so the civil rights movement or the freedom movement really picks up steam in the 1960s, and it starts with four students at North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro. They enter a Woolworths after making purchases there, and then they sit down at the lunch counter reserved for whites, and they remained there until the store closed. Once the store closed, they left, and in the morning they returned, and they did that for the next 5 months. And finally, in July, after 5 months, Woolworths actually takes away the white-only seat and desegregates itself on its own. And really, what this does is launches for the next decade activism, social change, and similar things are going to take place in a lot of public arenas, such as pools, parks, theaters, bowling alleys, libraries, restaurants, things that we take for granted today. But even in the 1960s, many of these things were segregated still. Um, and people really started thinking, what does it mean to be free, and whether it applied to all Americans. And throughout this time, people will risk physical and economic retribution to really find out or get their own type of freedom. And it's not just the civil rights, but we're talking about the new left, feminism, and other minorities. So it started in 1960, but then quickly in 1961, the CORE is created, and this is the Congress of Racial Equality. And what they do is they set up these freedom rides of integrated buses that go deep into the deep South, and they really want to test how people in the South view these things. Such as segregation on buses, trains, public transportation, stuff like that. And really, what happened is violence ensued. There were some fire bombs thrown into a bus in Alabama. People were beaten trying to escape the bus. In Birmingham, Klansmen attacked people with bats and chains, and the police stood and watched while this occurred. These are all on these freedom rides. And and the interesting thing about this is as people started to protest segregation, what really ended up happening is so did the resistance to desegregation, right? So violence ensued when people came to the South and said, you need to desegregate. The South was very much against it. And then probably one of the most famous cities of all the civil rights was Birmingham, Alabama. And in 1963, in June, uh, all over the South, there were 15,000 arrests in 186 cities. People were protesting all over the South, but it really culminated in Birmingham. Uh, and really, it's because it was probably one of the, if not the most violent and segregated cities in all of America. What happens is Martin Luther King Jr. comes in and he's arrested, and for inciting a crowd, and he's arrested for 9 days. And this is where he writes the letter from Birmingham jail. Uh, and besides giving all of these huge descriptions of flagrant racism, he this is when he calls on moderate whites to help. Uh, and then in May, he makes a bold decision to send African American children into the streets, and the police chief, whose name was Eugene Bull Connor, unleashed his forces, and uh, thousands thousands of people, millions of people around America saw on TV children being assaulted with hoses, nightsticks, attack dogs, etc. Right? So even though it works, you kind of have to wonder why MLK Jr. sent out kids, because he probably thought that the police weren't going to do anything to them, but unfortunately they did. At the same time, all of the U.S. saw this, and it was devastating. Um, and it really forces JFK to start thinking about desegregation. He's the president at the time. He can't see these things and not do anything about it because the whole world, the whole country saw it. Interestingly enough, though, the violence didn't stop. That same year, a sniper killed Medgar Evers, who was in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in Mississippi, and in Birmingham, a bomb exploded at a Black Baptist church that killed 4 girls. So even though in 1963 the feds are slowly starting to get involved in all of this, violence is still happening quite a bit in 1963. In fact, Bob Dylan sings about Medgar Evers as well as being kind of the voice for the 1960s. There's a song about the killing of Medgar Evers. 1963 also saw the March on Washington in August, late August, and this is when 250,000 people gathered in Washington. This is when MLK Jr. makes his "I Have a Dream" speech, and this was the high point of the nonviolent protest against segregation and racism in the country. The goals that they had set out for at the March on Washington were public works for unemployment, to make the minimum wage higher, and a federal law that will be enforced that bars employment discrimination. Basically, the slogan was jobs and freedom, right? And this is when King delivers his "I Have a Dream" speech. In fact, many of the organizers, along with Martin Luther King Jr. and other people, actually had to turn back quite a few people because a lot of the people who came to this March on Washington were more violent. The people who did March on Washington were nonviolent protesters. That needs to be understood. But at the same time, they were still calling on the federal government to desegregate the South and make sure that everybody had an equal share of things. So in 1963, things are still somewhat nonviolent as far as the protests go. All right, so the next 2 slides we're going to talk about the 2 presidents who kind of lead America through the Vietnam War and the 1960s in general. We'll talk about their domestic and foreign affairs. Firstly, we'll start off with John F. Kennedy. He actually served for less than 3 years, and in domestic affairs, he actually had few tangible accomplishments, even though today he's still viewed as this young, vibrant go-getter who did a lot for the country. And in actuality, he really didn't domestically. He viewed everything through a Cold War lens, and that was his main goal. His main goal was to win the Cold War. And the first thing he did was to try to get the world on his side. So one of the first things he did as president was create the Peace Corps, which, as you guys know, and hopefully some of you will get the chance to be in it, is sending young, bright Americans abroad to aid in economic, educational, infrastructural progress of developing countries. And in this way, this helps improve the U.S. images right throughout the world. And so he really hoped that this would get people on the side of democracy as opposed to communism. And closer to home, something occurred in 1959 that really changed the way the Cold War had been fought up to that time. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. Now, he was a dictator, but he was very close with American government and American interests. And basically, until then, Cuba was dependent on the United States. But when Castro comes into power, Castro, along with Che Guevara and his other guerrilla war veterans, they start nationalizing all American land holdings. American companies had a lot of private land in Cuba. Castro takes them from the American, and he makes them part of the state, and he also signs a huge contract with the USSR to give them sugar, which the United States took to mean that Castro was siding with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So what ends up happening is Eisenhower's the guy who creates Dwight Eisenhower is the guy who creates the embargo on Cuba that we know of today, and that's kind of how as far as he took it. Now, when Kennedy comes in, he starts the CIA to begin training anti-Castro exiles, people who Castro has kicked out of Cuba, who has left Cuba, who had their land taken away, or they were uh, enemies of the government in some shape or form. A lot of these people moved to Florida, and so the CIA begins training them. So in April 69 or April of 1961, you get the Bay of Pigs, and what this was a CIA's invasion of Cuba with Cubans who were trained by the CIA to overthrow Castro, and it was a disaster from the start. It was a total failure, and really what it did was push Cuba closer. They were found out real quickly. They landed on Cuba. The Cubans basically knew that they were coming. The CIA was supposed to give air support, and it never showed up, and it was just a disaster. And so this really moves Cuba closer to the USSR. Um, and after this, the CIA did all kinds of funny things trying to assassinate him. They tried to poison his pen, his food, etc., etc. All really a joke when you think about it. The interesting thing, though, is when Cuba came to power, or when Castro came to power, he came to America, and he really wanted to deal with the American government at this time, but the American government kind of shunned him and called him a communist, even though really he wasn't a communist, and he didn't really want to side with the USSR in the Cold War. But it was kind of well, it wasn't kind of, it was the United States government who pushed him away and said, no, we're not going to deal with you. And so that's kind of how it all started. And then you got the Bay of Pigs, etc., etc. This does not mean that Castro was a nice man. He wasn't. He killed a lot of Cubans in cold blood. He murdered a lot of people. Him and Che Guevara and all of these people did. But he did come to the United States first and said, we want to deal with you, as opposed to the USSR. So what happens with the Bay of Pigs is it's a disaster. It moves Castro closer to the USSR, and so in 1962 we get what is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Earlier in August of 1961 is when the Soviets build the wall in Berlin. So that is something that the United States really did not like at all. But the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was probably the closest the closest that the world had ever come to nuclear war before or after it. What this was, and if you've seen the movie 13 Days, you'll know what this is. If you haven't seen the movie 13 Days and you're interested in this, I really encourage you to watch it. It's a really good take on what happened for the 13 days and how the government reacted to everything, both governments. Kevin Costner's in it. It's a real movie. It's a Hollywood movie, but it's a good movie. So what happens is American planes were flying over Cuba, and they took pictures of Soviets putting missiles in Cuba, and it was obvious from the start that these missiles were capable of reaching the United States and carrying nuclear weapons. So for 13 days there was a standoff between the two, and even though most of his advisors told him to attack, JFK quarantines the island with the Navy after 13 days and demanded a removal of these missiles. After tense negotiations, this was a very tense time. We're kind of brushing through it. If you want to do your PowerPoint on this, you can also do that. It's a very interesting time period. After tense negotiations, Khrushchev agrees to withdraw the missiles from Cuba as long as the United States promises not to invade Cuba, and that the United States has to remove their missiles that can carry nukes from Turkey, because the United States had nuclear weapons in Turkey aimed at Moscow, and that last part was done in secret. Okay, so the Americans secretly removed their missiles from Turkey, and the standoff ended. There was a lot of ways that this could go, but in actuality, this was by far his biggest moment, JFK's moment, because he actually did, him and Khrushchev, they, instead of attacking each other, did sit down and talk about how they could end this without bloodshed. Um, but and also this changes JFK's whole view of how the Cold War should be fought, because he realized how many people would have died had things gone awry. So instead of kind of fighting the Soviets and trying to win the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he really starts talking to them about banning testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and space, and getting rid of all of the nuclear weapons that they were using and building up, the whole mutually assured destruction thing. Um, and like I said, even though he really wasn't, he's a Catholic from Massachusetts, he really wasn't that concerned with desegregation and how civil rights were going on in the South. But like we talked about in 1963, it was what happened in Birmingham and all over the South was too much to ignore. So he had to do something, because before that he was preoccupied with foreign affairs. So a couple things that he does do is he does use the Federal Reserve forces at the University of Mississippi when they wouldn't when the police in I think it's Biloxi, Mississippi, where the University of Mississippi is. I can't remember exactly where it is. When the officials there would not let African Americans into the college, even though a judge mandated that the college had to be desegregated. All right, a judge mandated it. The authorities just threw that out the window, and they blocked entrance from the African American students to get in. Um, so he did send federal forces down there, but he told them not to intervene, not to be violent. And a lot of the activists that saw violence in 1963 were not really helped by the federal government that much, because the the federal government at this time insisted that local law enforcement was a local matter. All right, he was really loath to bring in federal forces in cases like this, but he felt like by 1963 something had to happen, especially after Birmingham. So in June of 1963, he goes on TV demanding laws that ban discrimination in all public places. Excuse me. He says the nation faced a moral crisis. And this is really what we kind of talked about last week. JFK just says in his speech, "We preach about freedom around the world, but but can we say this to the world and each other, that this is the land of the free, except for the Negroes?" This is from his speech. So basically, he says what we talked about last week. You can't be an American and tell everybody they're not free when minorities in America are still second-class citizens. So he comes up with a Civil Rights Act, and he starts pushing it through legislation, but he doesn't live to see the bill enacted, because on the 22nd of November 1963 he was assassinated. And if you would like to do your PowerPoint on the assassination, this would also be an interesting thing, because of all the conspiracy theories. And there's a pretty good movie out there made by Oliver Stone called JFK. I think Kevin Costner's in that one too, actually. Tommy Lee Jones and some other people. And it's all about maybe the mob was involved and the federal government. And that's what your book Libra is about. So if you're interested, there is that as well. Okay, so after JFK gets assassinated, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, becomes president. He grew up in one of the poorest parts of the United States, the Central Texas Hill Country. He was a school teacher, and really he was more about domestic change. And really what LBJ tries to do at the beginning is create another New Deal. But what ends up happening is all of his time and effort and money starts going to the Vietnam War, and essentially he leaves the presidency a broken down, unpopular man. Perhaps one of the most unpopular presidents of all time when he actually left. 5 days, but he did try to do things in the domestic arena. 5 days after JFK was assassinated, he passes the Civil Rights Act along with Congress, um, which means that discrimination was prohibited in employment, hospitals, schools, restaurant, hotels, theaters, etc. And gender was also involved in this. And really, what the Democrats were worried when this passed was that they would lose the South to the Republican Party, right? Because the South was still very Democratic at this time, voted Democratic. Um, Interestingly enough, though, in the 1964 elections, the Republican Party put up Barry Goldwater, who was this really staunch conservative, cold warrior, talking about how all the New Deal stifled innovation, and he voted against the Civil Rights Act. And in a twist of kind of political fate, Johnson and the Democrats swept through the election and through Congress, right? So the choice of Barry Goldwater in 1964 was a very poor one for the Republican Party. But actually, at the same time, this is really when the Republican Party galvanizes itself, and it will become the powerhouse for basically, besides Jimmy Carter, until President Clinton again. So they start forming all these groups like the YAF, the Young Americans for Freedom, things like that, and they come out with the Sharon Statement, which was made in Sharon, Connecticut, with a college professor and a bunch of students. And this was kind of the conservatives' credo for the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Basically, they argued that the free market was personal freedom, and what goes along with that is a limited government, and really what the greatest threat to the United States as a whole is communism, international communism, and this kind of rang true for a lot of people, and slowly conservatives start getting votes in the Southwest, Southern California, as well as the Deep South, because there were still people very upset about the Civil Rights Act. Um, but for the most part, the Sharon Statement didn't really deal with race relations. They talked more about law and order, freedom of association, and the evils of welfare, right? Of course, at this time in the 1960s, the people on welfare were mostly minorities in the country. So even though they're not talking about race relations, they still are in a backhanded kind of way. Um, what LBJ's whole idea was to talk about the greats. He called the Great Society, and basically this was his New Deal. This was him trying to get health services to the poor and elderly with Medicaid and Medicare. He poured funds into education and urban development. He created PBS, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but at the same time he expanded the power of all of this expands the power of the federal government. Um, and it was basically LBJ's response to how economically advanced the country was in the 1960s. He's thinking to himself, we have all this money, let's spend it on our people and create, a great society. So what he calls. Um, he also kind of helps pioneer the Voting Rights Act, which also along with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. And Selma is a place where 355 of 15,000 African Americans could vote. This is when Jr. tries to walk across the bridge singing "We Will Overcome," and he gets beaten up by the cops on TV again, right? And so, even though LBJ was more interested in race relations and domestic things than JFK, they still had to act on this because the whole world and the country saw policemen beating up African Americans once again. Um, and so the Voting Rights Act is the 24th Amendment outlawing poll taxes, which basically means and allows the federal government to register voters. So this was just one more step in making sure that African Americans got the vote. Okay, and a lot of it had to do with things that people in the South were doing to minorities, right? They're kind of digging their own graves, so to speak. LBJ's centerpiece of the Great Society was his war on poverty, right? Because he grew up poor and he knew what it felt like, so he tried to completely eradicate it, which, as we know today, is going to be hard to do. When he was president in the 1960s, about 40 to 50 million people lived below the poverty line, the federal government mandate for poverty. And really what he does is he attributes it to an absence of skills and a lack of proper attitude, education, and that the hard work habits that built America had been lost. Um, so what he does is he tries to create good manufacturing jobs for people like in Appalachia, or urban ghettos, places where people have little hope of advancement. He tries to create jobs for them. Timber companies, things of that nature, kind of New Dealish without the acronyms. Um, he did create food stamps, um, but his whole idea of food stamps was to equip the poor with skills and to rebuild American spirit, right? So he basically argued, if you're not going to eat, children who are poor and don't get the nutrients are not going to get an education. This is back in the 1960s. So the whole idea of food stamps created was basically to help kids get energy and people to get energy, so they'll go out and with a full stomach and find a job or go to school and learn skills so that they can advance out of the and get out of the vicious circle of being poor. Um, this is when you also get things like Head Start, job training, legal help, and scholarships. Many of these things that we still have today from the federal government. This is kind of LBJ's thing. Um, and he was really the first president to ever say there is a difference between being black and white and how you live in poverty. Because basically he says centuries of slavery have, basically he said, African Americans were slaves for hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden they got their freedom and they were told to go get a job, right? Without any skills. Nobody taught them anything. The whole idea of Reconstruction was a complete disaster, right? And so he says it's just not fair. He says poor people are staying poor in this country, and their families were poor 100 years ago, right? He says nothing has changed from 1865 to 1965 for a lot of these families because nobody is helping them. And he says it's a cycle. I think people still talk about this today quite a bit, right? It's hard, even in America today. You really, really got to get lucky and work really hard to get out of the cycle of being poor. That's what a lot of people argue anyways. And this whole idea comes from LBJ in the 1960s. At the same time, the black movement began to change a little bit. Up until 1965, it was fairly nonviolent. The whole desegregation ideal, led by Martin Luther King Jr. and lots of other pastors and ministers throughout the country, relatively nonviolent. But in 1965, you get the ghetto uprisings in the South between African Americans and police. But the main one was in Harlem in 1964. That's the one that really started it all. And this was larger than the Watts uprising in 1965. 50,000 African Americans took part at the same time in 1964 in Harlem. They attacked police, firemen, looted stores, burned things. Basically what you would think of as a riot today. 35 people died, 900 were injured. There was $30 million in damage. Policemen and rioters both died, both were injured, and it kind of spreads through the Northeast. By 1967, 23 people were dead in Newark, New Jersey, 43 in Detroit, and hundreds of millions of dollars of damages in kind of the Northeast northern sector of the country, where people didn't really think that these type of things would happen, did happen, and it all kind of started in Harlem. So the federal government under LBJ comes out with this report that basically blames segregation and poverty, and indicts white racism for all of this, but it had no proposals for change. So the whole idea is LBJ and the federal government keep saying, well, this is why people are in poverty, and this is why they can't get out of the cycle, but they couldn't really come up with a very good plan to help people get out of it. He tried with the Great Society, but as we'll see, because of the Vietnam War and because of just the bureaucracy getting too big and inefficient, things really slowed down quite a bit. And so this is when you get, because of these ghetto uprisings, you get people like Malcolm X. Um, and he insists that African Americans need to take control of their political and economical resources in the communities that they live in and rely on their own efforts rather than working for the white man, which basically means either working for the white man or the federal government. He drops his slave name Little. His name was Malcolm Little in prison to X because X symbolized African American separation from Africa. And while he's in prison, he converts to Islam, and he becomes the Nation of Islam's spokesman. And he was a sharp critic of integration and nonviolence. He says we don't need to desegregate. What we need to do is create our own communities and not let white people in, and we'll run it how we want to run it. And he was very much against nonviolence, basically saying, obviously this has not worked because look what's happening. We've been nonviolent for 6 years, give or take, and nothing has changed. He was really the intellectual father of what we know as the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, things like that. Um, and he came up with the whole idea of black is beautiful. He was a little imprecise because sometimes he argued for more black senators. Sometimes he argued for all black Americans to move back to Africa, and because they were a colonized people here, and he wanted people to go back to Liberia. And so, he changed his stance a lot, but the main idea of Malcolm X is that we need to do it through pro-action, right? And if violence ensues, then violence ensues. He's really the guy who comes up with the idea of calling people Afro-American instead of Negro, right? He says, quit calling each other Negro because that's what white people call you, or a worse word. He says, quit calling each other that. Start calling yourselves Afro-Americans, things like that. And he's kind of the guy who starts wearing the natural, in quotation marks, afro of pride. He says, look at the hair we have, be proud of it, wear it like you want to wear it, not how people think you should wear it. And so really out of all of this, especially Malcolm X, in Oakland in 1966, you get the Black Panther Party. And these people this group was notorious for armed self-defense, but mainly in response to police brutality. Okay, so you have to understand that all of these things are happening because it's a reaction to things that are occurring. The Black Panther Party, and you can do I'd be interested to see a PowerPoint on this group. They were young, they were armed people wearing military garb. There's a picture of them here. But at the same time, they were also trying to help African American communities. They ran health clinics, schools. They tried to get impoverished children breakfast before they went to school as much as possible in the Oakland area. So even though they were violent, at times, most of that was a reaction. And really what they were trying to do was change the economic factor in the ghettos of Oakland. But because they were violent and they were armed and they scared people, the FBI and the police really went after them in a violent way. I mean, most of their leaders died in shootouts, and basically the organization was destroyed from the top down. It was very specific, and a lot of them died violent deaths, actually. And so you have this going on, and unfortunately, like I we've talked about, and unfortunately for this war against poverty and LBJ's movement to make everybody free and make sure that everybody gets food and an education to help themselves get out of poverty, all of this stuff gets derailed because in 1967 the Vietnam War really ratchets up. Um, and the Great Society gets put on the back burner, and it never really gets gotten to again. So when the Vietnam War kind of ratchets up in 1967, 68, uh, people were very surprised that white students were protesting. This is the first time in American history that this has occurred. Um, but at the same time, it's not that these students, they didn't look to the USSR as a model of working class uh, utopia. They knew what the USSR was about. They knew it was not democratic, but what they more spoke about was loneliness, isolation, and kind of this alienation in the face of this of bureaucracy. And for the first time in the history of America, in the late 60s, there were more college students, about 7 million, than there were steel workers and farmers in the country. And so this kind of signals the change uh, of discourse in America at this time, because now you have more people going to school than ever before. And these students really loved the sit-ins and kind of rejecting what we would consider the middle class mainstream, right? We talked about last week about the affluent society and this idea of conformism. These are the children of the people who conformed, and they said, we don't want that, right? That's what the Kinks said. I'm not like anybody else, that kind of idea. Um, and so they come out with the Port Huron Statement, which is this new vision of establishing a democracy of individual participation where the individual makes the choices about the quality and the direction of their life. Okay, so they're moving freedom from this idea of either fighting the Cold War, being anti-communism, or conformism, having as much as you possibly can, to this idea of I'm going to make my own choices. Okay, I'm going to choose what I do with my life and the quality of life and where it's headed. Okay, so it's called the New Left. Today, this would be more of maybe a kind of a right center idea of more of the individualistic idea, but at the time, this is what would be considered the New Left. And really, what lit all of this fire was the Vietnam War. Truman, just a real quick background of Vietnam. If you want to do your PowerPoint on this, you can. The Vietnam War is just so huge that you could do a whole year's worth of class on it, and I'm going to try to do it in like 5 minutes. But just to give the background, Truman and Ike had cast their lots with the French colonials. The French got southern Vietnam after World War II. Vietnam was cut in half, just like Korea. The communists got the north. The Allies got the South, and so France got it. If you ever watch Apocalypse Now, that's what that movie's about. The movie's actually based on a Joseph Conrad book about the Congo, which was written 100 years ago, but they use Vietnam. It's the same idea. Um, and after the French were defeated in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and they left South Vietnam because they couldn't take it anymore. And really, the United States had been financing the French effort in Vietnam for the last 10 years. So once 1954 happens, Eisenhower and then JFK and then LBJ all feared that the South would go communist, and they also feared what the public would think if the world would think if the United States left. You got to view this through the Cold War eyes. This would be a victory for the Soviet Union, and that is something that they could not deal with. So what they do is, instead of just leaving, the United States stays, um, to try to halt the spread of third world revolutions, right? It's the whole idea of the domino theory, right? If one falls, then the next falls, then the next will fall, then the next will fall, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty soon the communists will get what they wanted all along, which is world revolution, right? And so the United States government said we can't deal with that. Um, and so in 1963, what JFK does is he he approves a coup that sets up a dictator in the South, actually a Catholic guy from Vietnam called Ngo Dinh Diem, who had an American wife and studied in America. And JFK supports his coup, and he overthrows the Southern government in the early 1960s, and then so he becomes this puppet for the United States. Unfortunately for the U.S., the guy was a dictator, and he was a terrible human being, and he started killing people, and he ruled with an iron fist. So eventually, what ends up happening is. I'm sorry, this is the late 1950s. In 1963, JFK approves a coup of Diem, and so the United States overthrows the legitimate South Korean government because they didn't like him anymore, and he wasn't playing ball, and he wasn't a good man. Um, and so by the time that JFK was assassinated, and then we just put somebody else in Diem's place. By the time JFK was assassinated, there were 17,000 advisors, quote unquote, in South Korea. These were basically CIA, top military brass, people who were starting to arm the southern Vietnamese army for an impending attack or to be attacked from North Vietnam. This is in 1963. Um, and then after JFK was assassinated, LBJ comes on the scene, and he knew little about foreign affairs. But unfortunately for him, in August of 1964, you get the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And what this was is the North Vietnamese were patrolling I believe it's the South China Sea, and they came upon a U.S. vessel. They actually fired on a U.S. vessel. In supposedly international waters, but people think today that the United States vessel may have not been in international waters. They may have been violating the peace treaty, but you can look into that if you would like to. But anyways, the North Vietnamese fire on the U.S. vessel, and a lot of people argue that they didn't even fire on them in the first place. This was just a whole thing that was rigged up to start the Vietnam War. You can look into it more if you're interested. And so once this happens, Johnson says this is aggression, and Congress and everybody was really upset. And so Congress authorizes the president to take all necessary measures to repel this armed attack. And basically, it was a blank check to go to war. The Congress gave the president a blank check to go to war. And as we will see, this was a very big mistake and something that the Congress makes good on later. Presidents nowadays do not have near the power they did in the 1960s, and that is because of the Vietnam War. So in 1964, the airstrikes begin in the north and ground troops in the south. By 1968, there were 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and as you all know, if you want to read Raw Man, it's a very good description of what happens in Vietnam. You probably have all seen Vietnam movies. If not, go rent Platoon or Netflix. Sorry, you guys don't rent movies anymore. Netflix Platoon or Full Metal Jacket. Think Hamburger Hill, any of those things, Deer Hunter. The Vietnam War was brutal, and it was hot, and it was wet, and there was malaria, and there was drugs, and just it was not a good war to be in. And if you read Raw Man, you will see firsthand how bad it was. The North Vietnamese were terrible to POWs, and they had the camp known as the Hanoi Hilton. That's where John McCain was, and that's, if you're interested, why people call Jane Fonda Hanoi Jane. Look that up. On Vietnam, the United States dropped more tons of bombs than both sides in World War II put together. And they used the very toxic Agent Orange to destroy forests so they could find the Viet Cong. They bombed with napalm. And by the way, Agent Orange was a really deadly thing, and it affected a lot of veterans as well. So a lot of veterans came back from Vietnam and 10, 15, 20 years later started getting headaches, started breaking down, started getting cancer, things like this. And all of this was due to all of the nasty stuff that we dropped on Vietnam trying to find these guerrilla warriors in the forest. Um, and what's really important about Vietnam is that it's the first war in U.S. history that people could watch, right? It was on TV, and so every night the war was coming in. We take this for granted, but every night the Vietnam War was coming into people's homes for the first time, uh, basically in the history of the world. And this is a very, very large reason why the anti-war movement started, is because people could actually see what was happening. Um, and a lot of other reasons started because of the anti-war movement. College students were exempted from fighting, right? They started a draft, but if you went to college, you were exempted. So basically, the people who were fighting were working class kids who couldn't afford or couldn't or didn't even think about going to college. I know it's hard to think, but in the 1960s, not everybody went to college like they do nowadays, right? They didn't have the option to, whereas you do today. Um, People went to Canada. Um, and really in 1967 the whole anti-war movement really gets going because Martin Luther King Jr. was really one of the first prominent Americans to say that the war was violent and that it was draining resources at home. And he said it's especially violent for the African American community because these are the people that are poor whites from the South and African Americans from throughout the country were the people who were being sent there. And he says, you're just sending poor people to war to be fodder. This was MLK's idea, and he was one of the really first people to say this. And he says, not only that, he says, we're sending all our money to Vietnam when what we really should be doing is trying to help the people in our own country. In 1967, he's the real first prominent person to come out and say this. And you get things like the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, who, you know, started talking about burning draft cards or fleeing to Canada. And in October 1967, you get 100,000 people assembled at the Lincoln Memorial. And it's the famous picture of these are the people. The famous picture of the guy putting a flower. The National Guard was brought out, and the kid puts the flower in the rifle of the National Guardsmen. That was the October 1967 counterculture movement. And there's so much to the 60s that you guys can do a certain movement for a PowerPoint. There's all kinds of things you can look at. You can look at music, movies, all kinds of things that happened. But as time progresses, this counterculture really starts to move away from the idea of like participating in a democratic government to basically talking about cultural freedom, and basically openly rejecting the values of middle class America openly. And you guys have all seen all of these videos and songs about the 1960s movement, Make Love Not War, that type of thing. And that is an open rejection of the norms of American society up to that time. And it's really the first time in American history where there was a huge rejection of what people would consider the norm of clothing, language, sexual behavior, drug use, which drug use before the 1960s was very confined to a small section of society, right? And in the 1960s, it just erupts. And their whole rallying cry was liberation, right? And they're not talking about what their liberation and their idea of freedom is just from the 1950s and from what their parents want them to do, from the Vietnam War, from and burning their draft cards and having sit-ins at college and doing things that the establishment doesn't want them to do. All right, so quickly we'll go through a few of the new movements that started the rights revolution and kind of how they fit in the world today, or the United States today. Um, I think we've already talked about the feminine mystique, but during the 1950s, a lot of people really thought that the women weren't using their power right. They really could have been used as a potentially in the Cold War, but this really didn't come to a head until 1963. And what happens in 1963 is she starts talking about how talented, educated women were trapped in a world that views marriage and motherhood as a primary goal. And really, she's one of the most influential women's rights movements of the pioneers of the 20th century. She gets deluged by all of these letters from women saying how bad life was in the suburbs and how the law was just being too slow and how even when sex discrimination was banned, it didn't really work. So in 1966, she creates NOW, which is the National Organization for Women. Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, becomes president. And really what she does is she models it on the civil rights movement, demanding equal opportunity in jobs, education, politics, and she attacks this false image of women that is held in mass media. Interestingly enough, the women's liberation movement is a little different. It becomes by 1967 kind of a different type of movement, and really what it is consciousness raising. They discuss the sources of discontent. Why do you think that life is so bad for you? And they really come out with a whole bunch of ideas. And it really bursts out in 1968 at the Miss America pageant, when protesters filled this trash cans at the pageant with objects of oppression like girdles, brassieres, high heels, Playboys, the Cosmo magazine, things like this. And really what they're talking about is personal freedom. And they're talking about personal freedom in all realms of life: sexual relations, conditions of marriage, standards of beauty, politics, voting, power to not vote as your husband votes, but how you want to, things like that. And the whole idea is, why shouldn't there be equality at home, right? And really what they do is, as you can see these pictures, they really attack things like abortion and saying it's a woman's right to choose what she wants to do with her own body, and self-determination to end a pregnancy. It's not just doctors. At this time, if a doctor felt like a woman was in danger of health risks, he or she could have terminated the pregnancy, but it was really not up to the woman or the husband whether or not to have an abortion, because it was illegal at that time. And it really works, because in 1962, only a third of women thought they were discriminated against, and 12 years later, it was 2/3. All right, so this is really a movement that really starts gaining steam in the 1960s, 1970s. Also, gay rights come to the forefront, and many people argue today that the biggest advancement of all of these movements from the 1960s, all of them, even the civil rights movement, is gay rights came to the forefront, and they actually were the victors out of all of this. And it really is the movement that has the most to thank for the 60s. In the 60s, most states had homosexual acts as illegal and sinful or mentally disordered. And even though there were many in arts and fashion, and everybody knew this, you still had to stay in the closet, so to speak. And really the advent of what we know of as gay liberation today was a 1969 police raid on the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village, New York, which is which was a notorious gay bar, and that's why it was raided, to break it up, because quote unquote it was illegal. And rather than bowing out, the people in the bar actually fought back. And what ended up happening is 5 days of riots followed. And gay and straight people both came out and said that your sexual orientation was a matter of rights, power, and identity. It wasn't really the government's power to tell you whether you were gay or you were straight. And even though prejudice in a lot of places does persist into today, this is really when the advent of gay rights begins. And nowadays, you have parades. Gay marriage is legalized. Your hometown, if you live, or the town you're living in now, if you live in Moscow, was the first city in Idaho to have a gay wedding. I think there were 3 or 4 2 weeks ago. So I mean, even though a lot of people are still prejudiced against this is real. Before the 1960s, this was just not spoken about at all, and 50 years later, it was a very quick turnaround. There was also a militant movement called Red Power, and this was an upsurge in Native American militancy. Um, Both Truman and Eisenhower had wanted to end reservations and integrate, which was basically a policy known as termination. Um, but it would also end the recognition of Native American sovereignty. So there were people who were on both sides of the fence there. Some people said, well, we want to end the reservation system, but then that also means that we'll lose the land that we're living on. So it didn't really pass. And so Truman and Eisenhower tried to pass this, but too many people protested, and so by the time Kennedy comes in, he just completely abandons it. Um, and when LBJ comes into power, he does give reservations and Native Americans more federal aid. But what they really wanted was more self-determination, right? They wanted to do what they wanted to do on their land, right? Without the FBI or the federal government coming in and telling them. So in 1968, they stage a protest demanding self-government. And in 1965, they occupied, or reoccupied to them, because it used to be Native American land, they reoccupied Alcatraz Island, claiming it had been seized illegally, which was kind of ingenious, right? It's an island, so it'd be hard to get them off of it. And in the years that followed, this kind of thing starts working, and so Native Americans started gaining greater control over education, and the economic development on reservations. And really, in essence, the idea of Native American pride really flourished from about from the late 1960s into the 1990s, and people identifying themselves doubled in those 20 years. I mean, it's still going on today, but it really hit its stride from 1970 to 1990. And this also kind of what goes along with the Red Power, and a lot of the ideas of this Native American movement was about the land and keeping it natural, and not paving paradise, so to speak. What kind of comes out of that and everything else is what's called the Silent Spring, and this is the environmentalist movement. These also started in the late 1960s. And really what they were arguing against was that progress meant endless consumption, and the whole idea that science and technology and economic growth will advance social welfare. And it was published by a marine biologist by the name of Rachel Carson. And what she talked about is stop using insecticides for mosquitoes, because those kill birds, and they cause animals to be sick. She argued against DDT, which isn't used anymore, but it's something that was used as an insecticide. A little later, people will start talking about nuclear war and stop having nuclear testing because it's bad for the environment. Even though it was small at first, this is really the beginning of the whole idea of treating the world better, and the idea that human beings may, or whichever side of the fence you're on, the whole idea that human beings may be causing bad things to happen to the planet kind of comes out of the 1960s. Before this, people didn't recycle, and you threw everything away. Nobody cared about landfills or things of that nature, and so this really opens people's eyes to that. Um, and so what comes out of this is the Sierra Club. They talk about lead paint, air pollution. And so actually it was Richard Nixon in the early 70s who passes the Clean Air Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And also in 1970 is the first Earth Day in US history. So the Silent Spring movement actually made gains quite quickly as compared to a lot of other things. And then as of today, we're still talking about this, as we should be. What also, perhaps most importantly, maybe not, depending on your viewpoint, is the rights revolution. And this is the Supreme Court of Earl Warren that sets the tone, and we've kind of already talked about the Warren Court. What the Warren Court begins to do is rein in all this anti-communist crusade kind of stuff. They make interracial marriage legal in all 16 states that said it was not lawful. In 1966, you get the Miranda warning, and what we know of today as the Miranda rights, right? Reading people's rights before they're arrested. This comes from the Warren Court in 1966. And perhaps the most controversial of Warren Court judgments that was made the whole time was the separation of church and state and saying a prayer and Bible readings in school. The Warren Court prohibited that in 1966. Obviously, today the most talked about was Roe versus Wade, and we'll talk about what that is. But the whole idea of separating the church and state and not saying a prayer before school was a very, very controversial thing at the time. This really made a lot of people upset. But the Supreme Court made it so he's saying the country is founded on that, and you can't read one prayer and not another. And the whole idea of separation of church and state is vital to keep the country going. And so obviously, Roe versus Wade is 1973, and we'll talk about what that is. But earlier in 1965, in Griswold versus Connecticut, the court in Connecticut overturned a law banning contraceptives, saying that the right to be let alone is the beginning of all freedom. Basically, in 1965, the Connecticut court system said the woman and the man have the right to choose whether they want contraception or not, and that is what freedom is: the right to be left alone. Okay, the right to make an individual choice by yourself or with your partner. And so Roe versus Wade occurs in 1973, 8 years later, and even though Warren had died 4 years earlier, it was really because of the Warren Court and because of Earl Warren that the whole idea of Roe versus Wade could move to the Supreme Court. And really what all Roe versus Wade is the constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy if you want to. Not because you may, the doctor says it may be unsafe for you to have a child, not because anybody else is telling you. They made it completely legal to have an abortion in the United States, and this was passed in 1973. And this was a huge deal, and obviously, as you guys know, there's still vigorous opposition to that decision today. Okay, so the Roe versus Wade happened in 1973. So for 30 years, 40 years. It's been 40 years since that occurred. And as we know that there's still, the whole idea of not saying a prayer before school has kind of gone by the wayside. But the one thing that happened because of this was the Roe versus Wade, and that's the one that people remember and are still debate today. And so really what kind of ends 1968's will end the whole 1960s with this. 1968 was a very important year for the Democratic Party. Late January 1968 saw the Tet Offensive, which was a complete surprise attack on the Vietnamese New Year, and it came into the United States as everybody's living room, and it looked like the United States and the South Vietnamese had lost the whole battle. It was a coordinated attack throughout Vietnam on South Vietnam and America, and from the TV it looked like America was losing. Eventually America actually wins, and it was a fairly significant logistical victory, but by 1968 people are seeing this, and Walter Cronkite, the most important newscaster in America, comes on TV and says, "What is going on over there?" For the first time on TV, Walter Cronkite, who is the most powerful man in TV at the time, looks at the Tet Offensive and says, "What is going on there?" And after that, LBJ and the Democratic Party and the whole idea of the Vietnam War becomes very, very controversial. And by March, 3 months after the Tet Offensive, LBJ, who was a broken man, says he's not going to run again. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed by James Earl Ray, and after that, the greatest outbreak of urban violence in the history of the United States erupts. D.C. had to be occupied, the whole city, by government forces, and the whole Democratic Party and LBJ just goes down the drain. In June, Robert Kennedy gets assassinated, and in Chicago at the Democratic rally where they picked the new presidential candidate, which was Hubert Humphrey, there were riots all over. And we will see that in 1968, this is when Richard Nixon comes back after losing to JFK, and he takes the presidential election. And really, until Clinton, if you don't count Carter, for basically the next 14, 15, 16 years, the conservatives take control of the presidency, and this is an important turning point, 1968. So that kind of ends that's kind of a long one, but that kind of ends our 1960s because there's a lot to cover. But you have to understand that a lot of the things that we're dealing with today as far as values and as a culture in society came to the surface in the 1960s.